The blood-soaked letter trembled in Josephine Everett's hands as she stared at her husband's handwriting, promising to end her life when he returned. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the bedroom of the grand house she'd called home for 3 miserable years, illuminating the bruises on her wrists that hadn't yet faded from his last visit. Outside, the wind howled across the Texas plains, matching the storm of fear that raged within her. It was 1875, and Josephine had spent too many nights cowering in fear of Marcus Everett, the wealthy cattle baron whose charm had masked a monster. Their wedding day 3 years ago had been the last time she'd seen her family. Her parents had died shortly after, leaving her alone in the world except for Marcus, who kept her isolated on his sprawling ranch outside of Austin. "Enough," she whispered to the empty room, her voice gaining strength with each repetition. "Enough." Josephine moved with newfound purpose, gathering only what she could carry in a small satchel: a change of clothes, her mother's locket, and the emergency money she'd been secretly hiding beneath a loose floorboard. According to the letter, Marcus would return tomorrow from his business in Fort Worth. She had mere hours to disappear. The night was moonless as Josephine slipped from the grand house, a cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She dismissed the housekeeper earlier that evening, claiming illness, knowing the woman reported everything to Marcus. The stable was dark and quiet as she approached, praying she could saddle a horse without alerting the ranch hands who slept in the bunkhouse nearby. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Everett?" The voice from the shadows made her heart stop. Josephine spun around, clutching her satchel to her chest. Thomas, Marcus's most loyal foreman, stepped into view, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "I'm just checking on the new mare," she stammered, knowing the lie sounded hollow even to her own ears. Thomas studied her for a long moment, his eyes flickering to the satchel. "Mr. Everett would be mighty upset to find his wife wandering alone at night." "Please," Josephine whispered, her voice breaking. "You've seen what he does to me." Something shifted in Thomas's weathered face. Without a word, he disappeared into the stable, returning moments later leading a saddled mare, not the flashy Palomino Marcus had gifted her, but a sturdy brown horse that wouldn't attract attention. "Head north," he said quietly, helping her mount. "There's a town called Willow Creek about 50 miles from here. My sister runs the general store there. Tell her I sent you." Josephine stared at him in disbelief. "He'll kill you when he finds out." Thomas shook his head. "I'm leaving too. Been planning it for a while. Can't stomach working for him anymore." He pressed a small pouch into her hand. "It's not much, but it'll help." "Thank you," she whispered, tears threatening to spill. "Go now and don't look back. When you reach Willow Creek, ask for Sarah Miller." With a gentle slap to the horse's flank, Thomas sent her galloping into the night, the sound of hoofbeats fading as she rode away from the only life she'd known as an adult, a life of fear and pain that she was determined to leave behind forever. Dawn was breaking as Josephine crossed a shallow river, putting more distance between herself and Marcus's ranch. Her body ached from hours in the saddle, but fear kept her moving forward. She knew her husband, he would not accept her departure. Once he discovered her missing, he would hunt her down like prey. The Texas landscape stretched before her, vast and intimidating. Josephine had never traveled alone, had never even been allowed to visit the neighboring ranches without Marcus's escort. Now, she was trusting her life to directions from a man she barely knew and the strength of a horse she'd never ridden before today. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly. Josephine stopped briefly to allow the horse to drink from a small creek, splashing water on her own face and neck. Her fine cotton dress, practical enough for the ranch but not for hard riding, was soiled and torn. She would need to find new clothes soon, something that wouldn't mark her as a wealthy rancher's wife. As the sun began to set, panic gripped her. She should have reached Willow Creek by now, or at least seen signs of civilization. Had she taken a wrong turn? The land looked the same in every direction, rolling hills covered in scrub brush and occasional stands of oak trees. Her horse was tired, its pace slowing despite her urging. Night fell, bringing with it a bone-deep chill that her thin cloak couldn't ward off. Josephine had no choice but to make camp, tethering the horse to a tree and huddling against its warmth. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by every sound: the call of night birds, the rustling of nocturnal creatures, the whisper of wind through the grass. Each noise might be Marcus, might be death approaching. Morning brought no relief. Her water was gone and hunger gnawed at her stomach. Worse, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain. Josephine mounted her exhausted horse, choosing a direction that seemed most likely to lead to civilization. The first raindrops fell an hour later, soon becoming a deluge that soaked through her clothes. The horse plodded forward, head down against the driving rain. Josephine was shivering uncontrollably when she finally spotted smoke rising in the distance. Relief flooded through her as she approached what appeared to be a small homestead, a sturdy log cabin with a barn and corral. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth within. Josephine guided her horse to the front of the cabin, barely able to dismount on her own as stiffness and cold had settled into her bones. She approached the door on trembling legs, raising a hand to knock when it suddenly swung open. A tall man with broad shoulders filled the doorway, a rifle held casually in his hands. His face was partially obscured by a beard, but his eyes were clear and alert as they took in her bedraggled appearance. "Can I help you, madam?" His voice was deep but gentle, with none of the suspicion she'd feared. I'm looking for Willow Creek," Josephine managed through chattering teeth. "I think I'm lost." The man frowned, leaning his rifle against the doorframe. "You're about 15 miles east of there. You shouldn't be out in this weather." He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in before you catch your death." Josephine hesitated, her gaze darting from the man to the wilderness behind her. He seemed to understand her fear. "The name's Francis Caldwell," he said softly. "Most folks call me Frank. I promise you're safe here. This door will always stay open. You can leave whenever you choose." Something in his steady gaze reassured her. Josephine nodded and stepped across the threshold, warmth from the hearth immediately enveloping her. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," she whispered, water dripping from her clothes onto the wooden floor. "Let me tend to your horse," he said, already pulling on a coat. "There's dry clothes in that chest, my sister's from when she visited last month. Help yourself. And there's stew on the stove." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone in the cabin. Josephine stood frozen for a moment, water pooling at her feet, before the promise of dry clothes and hot food propelled her to action. She changed quickly into a simple calico dress that was slightly too large but blessedly dry, and helped herself to a bowl of fragrant stew. She was seated at the table, color returning to her cheeks when Frank returned, rain glistening in his dark hair and beard. "Your horse is fed and rubbed down," he said, hanging his wet coat by the door. "Fine animal. Looks like it's been ridden hard, though." Josephine nodded, suddenly unsure what to say. How much should she reveal to this stranger? "I've been traveling for 2 days. Frank didn't press, just nodded and served himself some stew. "Storm's getting worse. Roads to Willow Creek will be mud by now. You're welcome to stay until it passes." "I don't want to impose, no imposition," he interrupted gently. "I don't get many visitors out here. Company's welcome." They ate in companionable silence, the rain drumming on the roof. Josephine found herself studying her host surreptitiously. Frank Caldwell appeared to be in his early 30s, with the weathered complexion of a man who worked outdoors. His hands were calloused but clean, his movements efficient and deliberate. He wore simple clothes, a faded blue shirt, worn jeans, and boots that had seen better days, but everything was neat and well-maintained. "Thank you for the meal," she said finally, setting down her spoon, "and for taking in a stranger." A hint of a smile appeared beneath his beard. "Out here, folks help each other. It's the only way to survive." He studied her for a moment. "You got a name?" She hesitated, then decided on the truth. Josephine Miller." She took Sarah's surname, hoping it might provide some protection if Marcus came looking. Frank nodded, accepting the name without question. "Well, Miss Miller, you're welcome to the bed. I'll take the chair by the fire." "I couldn't possibly." "You could and you will," he said firmly. "You look like you haven't slept properly in days." Josephine couldn't argue with that. The combination of warm food, dry clothes, and the rhythmic sound of rain on the roof was making her eyelids heavy. She allowed Frank to show her to the small alcove, where a narrow bed was neatly made up with a patchwork quilt. "Sleep as long as you need," he said, his voice kind but impersonal. "You're safe here." For the first time in years, Josephine believed those words. She was asleep almost before Frank had retreated to his chair by the fire. She awoke to sunlight streaming through a small window, momentarily confused by her surroundings. The events of the past days rushed back her escape, the harrowing journey, finding Frank Caldwell's cabin. Josephine sat up, smoothing her borrowed dress and running fingers through her tangled hair. The cabin was empty, but a coffee pot bubbled on the stove. She poured herself a cup, noticing a plate of biscuits covered with a cloth nearby. Outside, she could hear the rhythmic sound of chopping wood. Josephine stepped onto the porch, cradling the warm cup between her hands. Frank was at the woodpile, his back to her as he swung an axe with practiced efficiency. He'd removed his shirt in the morning heat, and she couldn't help but notice the play of muscles across his shoulders and back, so different from Marcus's soft, pampered physique. As if sensing her presence, Frank turned, wiping sweat from his brow with a forearm. "Morning," he called, setting the axe down and pulling his shirt back on. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in years," she admitted. "Thank you," he nodded, gathering an armload of split wood. "Weather's cleared. I can take you to Willow Creek today if you're ready." The thought of continuing her journey brought a rush of anxiety. "I don't want to trouble you further." "No trouble," he said, climbing the porch steps. "I need supplies anyway." As they ate breakfast, Josephine gathered her courage. "Mr. Caldwell." "Frank," he corrected. "Frank, I should tell you that I'm running from someone." She stared into her coffee cup. "My husband, he's a dangerous man." Frank's expression didn't change. "Figured it was something like that. The way you looked when you arrived, like you'd seen the devil himself." He took a sip of coffee. "Your business is your own, but if you're in trouble, I'm willing to help." Josephine felt tears threatening. "Why would you help a stranger?" His eyes met hers, steady and clear. "Because it's the right thing to do." It was such a simple answer, yet it touched something deep within her. Marcus would never understand such uncomplicated decency. Every action in his world came with expectations, with a price to be paid. 2 hours later, they were on the road to Willow Creek, Josephine riding her rested mare while Frank drove a small wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses. The journey gave her time to think, to plan her next steps. She needed work, a place to stay, a new identity somewhere Marcus wouldn't think to look for her. Willow Creek appeared on the horizon around midday, a small settlement nestled in a valley, with perhaps 24 buildings arranged along a main street. It wasn't much compared to Austin, but to Josephine, it represented freedom. "That's the general store," Frank said, pointing to a two-story building with a wide porch. "Sarah Miller runs it, lives above it. Good woman." Josephine's heart lifted at the familiar name. Thomas's sister. Frank glanced at her, surprised. "You know Thomas? He helped me escape," she admitted. "Told me to find Sarah." Understanding dawned in Frank's eyes. "Thomas works for your husband," she nodded, not trusting her voice. "Well, that explains some things," he murmured. "Sarah will help you. She's taken in others before." They pulled up in front of the store, and Frank helped Josephine down from her horse. The door opened before they reached it, revealing a woman of about 40, her dark hair streaked with gray and pulled back in a practical bun. "Frank Caldwell, twice in 1 month." "The world must be ending," she said with a smile that faded as her gaze settled on Josephine. Something like recognition flickered in her eyes. "And who might this be?" "Josephine Miller," Frank said, emphasizing the surname slightly. "She's had a rough journey. Thomas sent her." Sarah's expression shifted immediately. "Come in, both of you, right now." The interior of the store was neat and well stocked, with goods ranging from flour and sugar to tools and fabric. Sarah locked the door behind them and flipped the sign to closed before leading them through to a back room that served as both kitchen and living area. "Sit," she commanded, putting a kettle on the stove, "and tell me everything." Josephine hesitated, glancing at Frank. "Frank's trustworthy," Sarah said, noticing her uncertainty. "He's helped others in your situation." With a deep breath, Josephine began her story how she'd met Marcus Everett when she was just 18, dazzled by his wealth and apparent kindness. How the abuse had started subtly after their wedding, escalating over the years until she feared for her life. How Thomas had helped her escape when he found her attempting to flee. "Marcus will be looking for me," she finished, hands trembling around her teacup. "He has connections everywhere: law enforcement, government officials. He won't stop until he finds me." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Everett doesn't have friends in Willow Creek. We're too small to matter to men like him." "But if he tracks me here, then we'll deal with it," Frank said quietly from his position by the window. "You're not alone anymore, Josephine." The words brought fresh tears to her eyes. For so long, she'd been isolated, convinced that no one would stand against Marcus's power and influence. Now, in this small town, strangers were offering protection without hesitation. "I need work," she said, wiping her eyes. "I can cook, clean, so I could use help in the store," Sarah said thoughtfully. "And there's a room upstairs you're welcome to." "I can pay," Josephine insisted, reaching for the pouch Thomas had given her. Sarah waved it away. "We'll discuss terms later. For now, you need rest and safety." As Sarah showed Josephine to her room, Frank remained downstairs, gazing out the window at the quiet street. Something about Josephine Everett had affected him deeply: her courage, her vulnerability, the quiet dignity with which she carried her pain. It had been a long time since he'd allowed himself to care about anyone, not since Kathleen had died in childbirth 5 years ago, taking their unborn son with her. But caring was dangerous, especially for a woman being hunted by a powerful man. Frank knew he should deliver the supplies he'd come for and return to his solitary existence on his small homestead. Instead, he found himself agreeing to stay in town for a few days when Sarah suggested it, telling himself it was just to ensure Josephine's safety as she settled in. He couldn't have known that decision would change everything. The next morning, Josephine woke early, determined to earn her keep. She helped Sarah open the store, quickly learning the location of inventory and prices. By midday, she was confidently assisting customers, her natural grace and courtesy making a favorable impression on the townspeople. Frank appeared around noon, nodding politely to Josephine before engaging Sarah in a quiet conversation by the door. Josephine tried not to eavesdrop, but couldn't help overhearing snippets. Asked around discreetly. No strangers in town. Keep watch for a few days. Needs to change her appearance later. When there was a lull in customers, Sarah approached her with a small package. Some things to help you blend in, she explained, unwrapping items on the counter: a pair of scissors, hair dye, and simpler clothes than the fine dress Josephine had arrived in. The red hair makes you stand out too much. Josephine touched her auburn tresses, which had always been her pride. You're right, she acknowledged. It's too recognizable. That evening, Sarah helped her transform. Her long hair was cut to shoulder length and dyed a deep brown. The elegant posture she'd been taught since childhood was replaced with a more relaxed bearing. When she looked in the mirror, a stranger stared back: a simpler woman, unremarkable in appearance, exactly what she needed to be. It's perfect, she whispered, turning to Sarah with gratitude. One more thing, Sarah said, handing her a small box. Inside was a plain gold band. A widow draws less attention than a single woman. We'll say you lost your husband to fever last year. Josephine slipped the ring onto her finger, surprised by how different it felt from the ornate diamond Marcus had placed there 3 years ago. Thank you for thinking of everything. Thank Frank, Sarah replied. It was his idea. He's quite protective of you already. Josephine felt her cheeks warm. He's been very kind. Frank doesn't let many people close, Sarah said carefully. Not since he lost his wife. The fact that he's still in town says something. Before Josephine could respond, there was a knock at the door. Frank himself stood there, hat in hand, looking somewhat uncomfortable. Thought you ladies might join me for supper at the hotel, he said. They've got a decent cook. Sarah smiled knowingly. I've got inventory to do. But Josephine should get out, see more of the town. And so Josephine found herself walking down the main street beside Frank, conscious of curious glances from townspeople. The hotel restaurant was small but clean, offering simple fare that was better than anything Josephine had eaten at Marcus's elaborate dinner parties. You look different, Frank observed as they ate. It's a good disguise. I feel different, she admitted, like I'm becoming someone new. Who do you want to be? He asked, surprising her with his directness. Josephine considered the question. Someone brave, someone who makes her own choices. She looked down at her plate. I was so young when I married Marcus. I had no idea who I was or what I wanted. And now I know what I don't want, she said with a small smile. The rest I'm figuring out day by day. Frank nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's how most of us live out here, day by day, making it up as we go along. Is that why you live alone so far from town? A shadow passed over his face. After my wife died, I couldn't bear to be around people. Their pity was worse than the loneliness. I'm sorry, Josephine said softly. Sarah mentioned you'd lost someone. 5 years ago, he confirmed. Feels like yesterday sometimes. Other times, like another lifetime. They fell into a comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they walked back to the store, the setting sun painting the dusty street gold, Josephine realized she felt at peace for the first time in years. Thank you, she said as they reached Sarah's door, for everything. Frank shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with gratitude, just doing what's right. Nevertheless, I'm grateful. She hesitated, then impulsively reached up and kissed his cheek, his beard rough against her lips. Good night, Frank. She slipped inside before he could respond, but not before seeing the surprise in his eyes and something else, something that made her heart beat faster as she climbed the stairs to her room. The next week passed in a peaceful rhythm. Josephine worked in the store during the day, learning about the townspeople as they came to shop. She discovered that Willow Creek was a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business, yet they accepted her story of widowhood without question. Sarah introduced her as a cousin from back east, and that was enough for most. Frank remained in town, taking a room at the hotel. He appeared daily at the store on various pretexts, sometimes purchasing supplies he surely didn't need, other times offering to help with deliveries or repairs. Josephine found herself looking forward to his visits, to the quiet conversations they shared when Sarah tactfully found reasons to leave them alone. She learned that Frank had come west after the war, where he'd fought for the Union. He'd met his wife Kathleen in St. Louis, and they'd traveled to Texas together to start a new life. His grief when speaking of her was evident but tempered by time, a scar rather than an open wound. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Georgia, her parents' deaths shortly after her wedding, and the gradual realization that Marcus was not the man she'd thought she'd married. Frank listened without judgment, his steady presence a comfort as she recounted painful memories. On Sunday, he escorted both women to church, standing tall beside Josephine as curious eyes assessed the newcomer. Afterward, several families invited them to share Sunday dinner, but Frank surprised her by suggesting a picnic instead. "Just the two of us?" Josephine asked, aware of Sarah's knowing smile. "If that's all right," he said, suddenly uncertain. "I'd like that very much." They rode out to a small creek on the outskirts of town, spreading a blanket beneath a stand of cottonwood trees. The food was simple cold chicken, biscuits, and apple pie from the hotel restaurant, but the setting made it special. Wildflowers dotted the grass around them, and the creek gurgled peacefully nearby. "It's beautiful here," Josephine sighed, leaning back on her hands to gaze at the clear blue sky. "So different from Austin. Better or worse?" Frank asked, stretching out his long legs. "Different," she repeated. "Austin has its own beauty, but it's tamed, controlled. This feels wilder, more honest somehow." Frank nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's why I chose this land. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not." "Unlike people," Josephine said softly. "Some people," he corrected. "Not all of us wear masks." She studied him, this man who said exactly what he meant and did exactly what he believed was right. "No, I don't suppose you ever have." Their eyes held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Frank cleared his throat and looked away first. "How are you settling in at Sarah's?" "Well enough," Josephine said, accepting the change of subject. "She's been very kind, but I can't impose on her forever." "Have you thought about what's next?" The question had been on her mind constantly. "I should probably move on. The longer I stay in one place, the more likely Marcus is to find me." Frank frowned. "Running forever isn't much of a life. What choice do I have? He won't grant me a divorce. In his mind, I'm his property." "You could fight back," Frank suggested. "Legally, I mean. Sarah knows a lawyer in Austin who might help." Josephine shook her head. "Marcus has judges in his pocket, and even if I could get a divorce, he'd never accept it. You don't know him, he doesn't lose. Ever." Frank was quiet for a moment, breaking a twig between his fingers. "What if you weren't alone?" Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "There are people who would stand with you. Sarah, for one. Me, for another." "I couldn't ask that of you. Marcus is dangerous." "So am I when necessary," Frank said quietly, and something in his tone made her believe him. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Frank was on his feet in an instant, hand moving to the pistol at his hip. Josephine stood as well, heart pounding, until she recognized the riders as a family from church. The Nelson family waved cheerfully as they passed, clearly out for their own Sunday ride. Josephine waved back, but noticed that Frank remained tense until they were out of sight. "You're still worried he'll find me," she observed. Frank sighed, relaxing slightly. "I'm being cautious. Men like your husband don't give up easily." "No," she agreed, "they don't." The peaceful mood was broken, reality intruding on their idyllic afternoon. "Perhaps we should head back." They packed up in silence, the easy companionship of earlier replaced by a palpable tension. As Frank helped her onto her horse, his hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Josephine looked down at him, seeing concern in his eyes and something more, something that made her breath catch. "Josephine," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "Yes," she encouraged softly. He shook his head. "We should get back before the weather turns." The sky was clear, with no sign of approaching storms, but Josephine nodded, understanding his need for retreat. Whatever had been building between them, Frank wasn't ready to acknowledge it. Perhaps he never would be. The ride back to town was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. At the edge of town, they encountered the sheriff, a heavy-set man named Dawson who greeted Frank with a nod. "Caldwell." "Mrs. Miller." His eyes lingered on Josephine a moment too long. "Enjoying our little town, madam." "Very much," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite a sudden unease. There was something in the sheriff's manner that reminded her uncomfortably of Marcus's men. "Glad to hear it. Don't get many newcomers staying on." He tipped his hat and continued on his way, but Josephine felt his gaze on her back as they rode toward Sarah's store. "I don't trust him," she whispered to Frank. "Neither do I," he admitted. "Dawson's been sheriff for 15 years, keeps getting re-elected because no one runs against him." "Do you think he knows who I am?" Frank shook his head. "Not likely. But he's the type who notices newcomers, especially pretty women." Despite his reassurance, the encounter cast a shadow over the remainder of the day. That night, Josephine dreamed of Marcus, his cruel smile, his hands around her throat, his voice promising she would never escape him. She woke gasping, sheets tangled around her body, the room illuminated by moonlight. Sleep eluded her after that. She dressed and crept downstairs to the store, lighting a small lamp to check inventory as Sarah had shown her. Work would distract her from her fears, from the growing certainty that her time in Willow Creek was limited. She was so absorbed in counting sacks of flour that she didn't hear the door open. A hand clamped over her mouth, stifling her scream as she was dragged backward against a hard chest. "Mrs. Everett," a voice hissed in her ear. "Your husband sends his regards." Terror paralyzed her for a crucial moment before instinct took over. Josephine drove her elbow back into her attacker's ribs with all her strength, simultaneously biting down on the hand over her mouth. The man cursed and loosened his grip enough for her to break free, knocking over the lamp in the process. It shattered, oil spreading across the wooden floor and igniting instantly. The man, one of Marcus's hired guns, though she didn't know his name, lunged for her again as flames began to lick at the dry goods nearby. Josephine grabbed a heavy iron skillet from a display and swung it with all her might, connecting with the side of his head. He staggered but didn't fall, drawing a knife from his belt. "Fire!" Josephine screamed, backing away from both the man and the spreading flames. "Help! Fire!" Shouts erupted outside as the town's night watchman spotted smoke pouring from the store windows. The distraction was enough for Josephine to dash for the back door, the hired gun in pursuit. She burst into the alley behind the store, the cool night air a shock after the heat of the growing fire. A shot rang out, splintering the doorframe inches from her head. Josephine ran blindly, bare feet slapping against the dirt, nightgown billowing around her legs. Behind her, she could hear shouting as townspeople began to respond to the fire, but the footsteps of her pursuer were closer. She rounded a corner and collided with a solid form. Strong hands steadied her and she looked up into Frank's concerned face. "Josephine." "What, Marcus's man?" she gasped. "In the store. He started a fire." Frank pushed her behind him just as the hired gun appeared, pistol raised. Two shots exploded in the quiet night, so close together they sounded like one. The gunman crumpled to the ground as Frank staggered backward, blood blooming on his shirt. "Frank?" Josephine caught him as he sank to his knees, her hands pressing against the wound in his shoulder. "Help! Someone help us!" People were running toward them now, Sheriff Dawson in the lead. "What the hell happened here?" he demanded, taking in the scene: the dead man, Frank's wound, Josephine's nightclothes stained with blood. "He attacked me," Josephine said, still applying pressure to Frank's shoulder. "He worked for my husband." "Husband?" Dawson's eyes narrowed. "Thought you were a widow, Mrs. Miller. Or should I say, Mrs. Everett?" Josephine felt the blood drain from her face. "How did you got a telegram yesterday?" Dawson said, kneeling to check the dead man. "Marcus Everett's looking for his runaway wife, offering a substantial reward." His eyes traveled over Josephine's body in a way that made her skin crawl. "Didn't realize it was you until just now." "Sheriff," Frank's voice was weak but determined. "This man broke into Sarah's store, tried to abduct Mrs. Everett, and started a fire that's threatening the whole town. I suggest you focus on that rather than rewards." Dawson scowled but couldn't argue with the logic. The fire was indeed spreading, with bucket brigades already forming to combat it. "Get him to the doctor," he ordered two bystanders who helped Frank to his feet. "And keep an eye on her. I'll deal with this situation after we contain the fire." As they helped Frank toward the doctor's house, Josephine clung to his uninjured side, terror and guilt warring within her. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "This is all my fault." "No," Frank managed through gritted teeth. "Not your fault, his." The doctor, roused from sleep, quickly assessed Frank's wound. "Clean through the shoulder," he announced after examination. "Missed anything vital. You're a lucky man, Caldwell." "Doesn't feel lucky," Frank muttered as the doctor began cleaning the wound. Josephine hovered nearby, her face pale with worry. "Will he be all right? He'll live," the doctor assured her. "Though he'll be sore for weeks." He gave her a curious look. "You're Sarah's cousin, aren't you? Terrible business, that fire." Is the store. They're still fighting it," one of the men who'd helped Frank said. "But it's bad. Half the block might go before it's contained." Fresh guilt washed over Josephine. Not only had she brought danger to Frank, but she'd also destroyed Sarah's livelihood. "I need to find Sarah," she said, moving toward the door. "You need to stay put," the doctor countered firmly. "Sheriff's orders." "I don't care about the sheriff's orders. Sarah's store is burning because of me, Josephine." Frank's voice stopped her. "The sheriff knows who you are. If you go out there now, he'll hold you until your husband arrives." The blood drained from her face. "He wouldn't for the reward Everett's offering. He absolutely would." Frank struggled to sit up, wincing with the effort. "We need to get you out of town. Now." "I'm not leaving you wounded, and I can't leave without speaking to Sarah. I'll find Sarah," the doctor offered unexpectedly. "And I'll tell her where to meet you." He hesitated, then added, "My wife left an abusive husband back in Missouri. I understand what you're facing, Mrs. Everett." Josephine stared at him, hope flickering to life. "Thank you." "My wagon's behind the surgery," the doctor continued. "Take it and head for Frank's place. It's the safest option for now." Decision made, they moved quickly. Frank, despite the doctor's protests, insisted on leaving immediately. Josephine helped him into the wagon while the doctor gathered supplies: bandages, laudanum for the pain, food for the journey. "Tell Sarah to bring clothes and whatever money she can salvage," Josephine instructed as they prepared to leave. "And doctor, thank you." The night was chaos as they slipped out of town, men shouting as they fought the fire, women carrying children to safety. horses whinnying in fear at the smell of smoke. No one paid attention to a wagon leaving in the confusion, bearing a wounded man and a woman in a blood-stained nightgown. Josephine drove, following Frank's terse directions. Her hands shook on the reins, her mind racing with fear and guilt. If Frank died because of her, if Sarah lost everything because she'd offered shelter to a stranger. "Stop that," Frank said weakly from beside her. "I can hear you blaming yourself. How can I not? I brought this danger to your door. You didn't bring anything. Your husband did." His hand covered hers on the reins, surprisingly warm despite his pallor. "Josephine, look at me." She met his gaze, moonlight illuminating the determination in his eyes. "I chose to help you. Sarah chose to help you. Those were our decisions, freely made." He squeezed her hand. "And I'd make the same choice again." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Why, you barely know me." Frank was silent for so long she thought he might have passed out. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible above the creak of the wagon wheels. "Because from the moment you appeared at my door, I recognized something in you, a strength you didn't know you had. And because when I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to be alive." The words hung between them, more significant than any declaration of love, more binding than any vow. Josephine couldn't speak, could only clasp his hand tighter as they continued through the night toward the sanctuary of his homestead. Dawn was breaking when they arrived, Frank barely conscious from blood loss and exhaustion. Josephine helped him inside and onto his bed, changing his bandages as the doctor had instructed. When he finally slept, she sat beside him, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, each breath a reassurance that he lived, that her presence in his life hadn't destroyed him completely. Outside, she heard the approach of another wagon. Grabbing Frank's rifle, Josephine positioned herself by the window, ready to defend them both if necessary. Relief flooded through her when she recognized Sarah driving, accompanied by a man Josephine didn't know. "Thank God," Sarah exclaimed as Josephine opened the door. "Is Frank alive?" Josephine assured her. "Sleeping now." "Sarah, I'm so sorry about the store. Buildings can be rebuilt," Sarah interrupted, embracing her tightly. "Lives can't be replaced." She stepped back, gesturing to her companion. "This is Judge William Foster. He's an old friend and he may be able to help." The judge, a dignified man in his 60s, bowed slightly. "Mrs. Everett, I've heard much about your situation." Hope and suspicion warred within Josephine. "You're a judge, here to help me against Marcus Everett." "I'm a federal judge," he clarified, "and I've been building a case against your husband for some time. Corruption, bribery of officials, suspected murder of business rivals, the list is extensive." Josephine stared at him in disbelief. "You want me to testify against him?" "Your testimony would be valuable, yes. But more importantly, I want to help you obtain a divorce on grounds of cruelty and attempted murder. The attack in Willow Creek provides the evidence we need." "But Sheriff Dawson is currently in custody for accepting bribes," Sarah interjected with satisfaction. "The telegram he claimed to receive was a lie. Judge Foster arrived last night to arrest him and happened to be there when the fire started. It was almost too much to absorb." Josephine sank into a chair, overwhelmed by this sudden shift in fortune. "You really believe we can defeat Marcus legally, that a court will grant me a divorce?" "With my jurisdiction and your testimony, yes." The judge's expression was somber. "It won't be easy, Mrs. Everett. Your husband will fight and the process may be lengthy, but I believe justice will prevail." "And in the meantime?" Josephine asked, glancing toward the bedroom where Frank slept. "In the meantime, you stay somewhere safe," Sarah said firmly. "Here with Frank." "But the store, your livelihood, is insured," Sarah finished with a small smile, "and I've been thinking of moving on anyway. My brother Thomas wrote from Colorado. He's settled there, started a new life. Asked me to join him. Josephine felt tears threatening again. Sarah, I don't know how to thank you. Live well, the older woman said simply. Be happy, that's thanks enough. The judge cleared his throat. I should return to Austin. Mrs. Everett, I'll need a full statement from you, but it can wait until Mr. Caldwell is recovered. He handed her a card. When you're ready, contact me at this address, and be assured we will bring your husband to justice. After they departed, promising to return in a few days, Josephine checked on Frank. He was awake, watching her with alert eyes despite his pallor. You heard? She asked, sitting beside him on the bed. Every word. His hand found hers. It's really happening, Josephine. You're going to be free. It seems impossible, she admitted, after so long believing there was no escape. Believe it, he said firmly. And know that whatever happens, whatever you decide when this is over, he hesitated, then continued softly, this door will always stay open for you. Josephine's heart swelled with emotion. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned down and pressed her lips to his in a gentle kiss. Thank you, she whispered against his mouth, for everything. His good arm came around her, holding her close. Stay with me, he murmured. Not just until this is over. Stay. It was too soon for such declarations, too soon for promises when her life was still in turmoil. Yet Josephine found herself nodding, tears spilling onto their joined hands. Yes, she whispered, I'll stay. The journey to freedom was neither quick nor easy. Frank's recovery took weeks, during which Josephine nursed him with tender care. Their isolation at the homestead became a blessing, time to heal, to learn each other's ways, to build something new from the ashes of their past lives. Judge Foster visited regularly, building his case against Marcus Everett while simultaneously preparing Josephine's divorce petition. The process was complicated by Marcus's influence, but the judge was determined and methodical, gathering evidence of abuse and corruption that even Marcus's money couldn't erase. Sarah departed for Colorado after a month, leaving Josephine with tears and promises to write. The store in Willow Creek was sold, the proceeds split between rebuilding efforts for those affected by the fire and a nest egg for Sarah's new life. As summer turned to fall, Frank and Josephine fell into a comfortable routine. She tended the small garden while he resumed work on the barn he'd been building before her arrival. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson. Sometimes they talked of the future, of hopes and dreams long deferred. Other times, they simply sat in companionable silence, content in each other's presence. Their first kiss had not been repeated. Both understood that, until Josephine was legally free, certain lines could not be crossed. But their feelings grew in the waiting, deepening into something neither had expected to find again. The summons to Austin came in October, delivered by Judge Foster himself. Marcus Everett's empire was crumbling under federal investigation. Several of his associates had turned state's evidence, and Thomas had provided crucial testimony about the abuse Josephine had suffered. Now, she needed to appear in court to finalize the divorce. I'll come with you, Frank said immediately, his healed shoulder allowing full movement again. Josephine shook her head. This is something I need to face alone. Josephine, please understand, she interrupted gently. I left his house as a frightened victim. I need to face him as the woman I've become, the woman who found her own strength. Frank studied her face, seeing the determination there. All right, he conceded, but I'll be waiting for you here when it's done. The journey to Austin was surreal, returning to the city where she'd lived as Marcus Everett's wife, now transformed both inside and out. Her dark hair had grown out slightly, complementing the simple but well-made dress she'd purchased with her earnings from helping neighboring farms with sewing work. She no longer resembled the pampered society wife who had fled months ago. Judge Foster met her at the courthouse, his presence reassuring as they entered the imposing building. "He's here," the judge warned quietly, "with his lawyers. Remember, you don't need to speak to him directly." Josephine nodded, steeling herself for the confrontation. When they entered the courtroom, her eyes immediately found Marcus, seated at the defendant's table with two expensively dressed attorneys. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face lined with strain, but his eyes still held the cold arrogance that had once terrified her. Those eyes widened slightly when he saw her, clearly not expecting the transformation. Josephine held his gaze steadily, refusing to look away first. It was Marcus who finally broke the connection, leaning over to whisper something to his lawyer. The proceedings were mercifully brief. The evidence of abuse was overwhelming, and Marcus's attorneys, recognizing the futility of fighting both the divorce and the federal charges simultaneously, advised him to accept the judge's terms. Josephine would receive a modest settlement, far less than she was entitled to as his wife, but enough to start fresh. When the gavel fell, declaring her legally Josephine Miller once more, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It was done. She was free. As she left the courtroom, Marcus stepped into her path. Up close, she could see the rage simmering beneath his controlled expression. "This isn't over, Josephine," he said quietly. "You're still mine. You'll always be mine." Once, those words would have frozen her with terror. Now she simply looked at him with pity. "No, Marcus, I was never yours, and now I belong to myself." She stepped around him and continued walking, head high, heart pounding but step steady. Behind her, she heard Judge Foster warning Marcus against further threats, but the words barely registered. All she could think about was the road ahead, leading back to Willow Creek, to Frank's homestead, to the door that would always stay open for her. The return journey seemed to take forever, though in reality it was only 3 days. As the wagon crested the final hill, Josephine saw smoke rising from the chimney of Frank's cabin, a lantern glowing in the window despite the early hour. He was waiting for her, as promised. Frank emerged from the cabin as she approached, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Josephine barely waited for the wagon to stop before jumping down, rushing into his open arms with a laugh that held all the joy of her newfound freedom. "It's done," she said breathlessly as he spun her around. "I'm free, Frank, truly free." His smile was brilliant as he set her on her feet, his hands framing her face. "Welcome home, Josephine." This time, when their lips met, there was no hesitation, no shadow of the past between them. It was a beginning, a promise, the first page of a new chapter in both their lives. "I love you," she whispered against his mouth. "I think I've loved you since you opened your door to me that rainy night. And I've loved you since you had the courage to step through it," he replied, holding her close as if he'd never let go again. "My brave, beautiful Josephine." They stood together as twilight deepened around them, two souls who had found each other against all odds, in a wild land where courage was as necessary as breath. The door to the cabin stood open behind them, a symbol of the sanctuary they had created together, a home built on trust, respect, and love that had bloomed in the most unexpected of circumstances. In the years that followed, Josephine often thought of that night she had fled Marcus's house, terrified and alone. The journey had been harrowing, but it had led her here to a life richer and more fulfilling than she could have imagined. To Frank, whose quiet strength and unwavering support had helped her discover her own courage. To a love that didn't demand submission but celebrated freedom. Together, they built a life on Frank's homestead. The small cabin expanded as their family grew, first with the birth of their daughter, Sarah, named for the friend who had helped make their happiness possible, and later with their son, Thomas, honoring the man whose kindness had given Josephine a chance at a new life. News reached them occasionally of Marcus Everett. His empire had crumbled under federal investigation, his fortune diminished by fines and legal fees. The man who had once seemed invincible had been reduced to a shadow of his former self, his influence waning as his crimes came to light. Josephine felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only relief that he could no longer harm others as he had harmed her. She had moved beyond hatred to something like peace, focusing her energy on the life she and Frank were building together. On the 5th anniversary of her arrival at Frank's homestead, he surprised her with a gift, a new sign beside their front door, carved by his own hands. "This door will always stay open," it read, the words burnished into the wood like a promise. "So no one who needs sanctuary will ever hesitate to ask," Frank explained as Josephine traced the letters with trembling fingers. She turned to him, this man who had taught her the true meaning of love through his actions rather than empty words. "You are the best of men, Frank Caldwell." His arms encircled her waist, pulling her close. "And you, Josephine Caldwell, are the bravest woman I've ever known." Standing there in the doorway of the home they had built together, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that she had found what most people spend their lives searching for: not just love, but partnership, respect, and the freedom to be herself completely. The open door had led not just to sanctuary, but to the truest expression of home, a place where love resided, where family flourished, where the heart could finally, fully belong. And as the Texas sunset painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Josephine silently thanked the courage that had driven her to flee that terrible night, the first step on a journey that had led her not just away from pain, but toward the joy that now defined her days. The door would always remain open, a symbol of the hearts that had found each other against all odds in the vast, untamed beauty of the Wild West.